we haven't yet had a situation where a regime, a government, an ideology, which of the kind I just described, also has control of the most genocidal and dangerous weaponry. One way to think of it is that mutually assured destruction works until you have an opponent who loves the idea of destruction of every kind. People for whom mutually assured destruction sounds like an interesting thing to try.
That's right. Yes. Well, okay. I want to ask you about Iran and everything that's been happening in the last couple of weeks there. That must be tied, I guess, to Gaza and Hamas, because Hamas is sponsored by Iran, and Iran has promised to eradicate Israel if they can, and that would be the justification for the strikes against them.
Yes, one of the fascinating things about the post-October 7th war has been that it's gradually the IDF and the IAF, and now with American B-2 bombers backing them, have managed to roll their enemy up pretty successfully, and all the way back to the main backer in the Revolutionary Islamic government of Iran, which has misgoverned Iran since 1979. That's one of the reasons why I mention early in the book what I think of as one of the two worst journeys of the 20th century, the most lamentable journeys, which is the flight that took the Ayatollah Khomeini from Paris to Tehran in 1979, brought him back from exile in the West and to Iran, where once he seizes power and once his militias and everything are embedded, and once he's killed and imprisoned and murdered his political opponents, manages to have a vice-like clamp on Iran, and then to export their ideology across the Middle East. The great colonial power of the era in the Middle East is Iran. Colonized Iraq, colonized Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, wrecked these countries as its militias have been there, and of course Gaza, where Iran not only knew of the October the 7th attacks and the planning, but had to get approval for it, and had trained and armed Hamas in the years prior to the attack. It's been very interesting watching the process of the rollback occur since the 7th, as Hamas has been pretty much decimated, still holding on. They still have hostages that they're still holding, Israeli hostages. But then the destruction of Hezbollah, to the extent that their grip on Lebanon is massively, massively weakened. The destruction of Iran's proxy forces in Syria, and now the regime in Iran standing pretty much alone and certainly naked, with American and Israeli fighter jets operating over almost all of Iran with ease. And it's been an astonishing thing to see. And then the removal of the nuclear program that the mullahs have been dreaming about for decades.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about how much we can trust the media, mainstream media, and the U.S. government and Israel on what we assume to be true about Iran. Let me cue this up for you. I just listened to Lex Friedman's podcast episode in which he hosted a debate with Scott Horton, the author and director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and host of the Scott Horton Show. And for the past 3 decades, a staunch critic of U.S. foreign policy and military interventionism. His debate opponent was Mark Dubowitz, is the chief executive of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, host of the Iran Breakdown podcast, and a leading expert on Iran and its nuclear program for over 20 years. Okay, I never heard of either of these guys. I know next to nothing about Iran, so I thought, okay, this will be interesting. So Dubowitz cues up and just basically for 15 minutes outlines everything we've been hearing about Iran for the last 30 years, and pretty much echoing, the Trump outline of what's happened recently. And then his response is, none of that is true. It's all lies. We've all been fed misinformation, disinformation, malinformation from the U.S. government, from Israel. Israel is telling the U.S. government lies about things. We're a puppet of them. And he just went on, and they went back and forth for 4 hours. Okay, so what's an outsider like me who knows nothing about Iran to make of these kind of debates? Who should I trust and believe?
Well, the first thing is that there is a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of it, I'm afraid, comes from people who've mugged up very recently on this. This is, of course, as I think you and I have talked about before, Michael, this is a perennial problem in our era, which is that everybody can become a kind of expert fast, thanks to the glories of Wikipedia and Google and so on. And for instance, I've noticed that in recent weeks, there have been a large number of people who said things like, well, Netanyahu has said for decades that Iran was on the brink of getting a nuclear bomb, and it hasn't got it, so we're being lied to. And it's like, well, no, thanks to very significant interventions, presumably by the Israelis, things like setting off the Stuxnet virus in 2010 that rampaged through the computers of the nuclear project in Iran. Thanks to things like that, the Iranians have consistently been set back in their enrichment process, in their development of a deliverable nuclear weapon. So there are quite a lot of people who seem to be bemused by things that if they'd have followed them even remotely closely, they could have realized they're misinformed on. I think it's a striking thing that the weaponization of every aspect of something like the strikes that happened last week now, week 4, is extraordinary to watch. There's been this report that the Trump administration has pushed back on a lot, which is from a part of the national security infrastructure, which claims that the project in Iran has been set back, maybe weeks and months, but not significantly. That seems to have been a report written almost immediately in order to leak, which, everyone leaks, people leak in every direction, but that smells to me to be very, very incorrect. I mean, the idea that for instance, the reactor at the Fordow facility, which needed, I think, a couple of bombs to destroy, which had something like 10 or 12 dropped on it. The idea that that's in any kind of workable shape for the foreseeable future, I think, is crazy. There are questions about whether or not materials were taken out of Fordow beforehand, and if so, by whom. But this is something that, the world, not just America, should keep a very close eye on. But yeah, I think in general, the bodies that have been expert on this, I think Mark Dubowitz and the others at FDD are very good examples of people who've been on top of this for many years, in fact decades now, should be trusted. And there are international agencies like the IAEA, which have been committed to trying to keep an eye on the Iranian project and to as accurately as they can sum up what the intent and the capabilities of the regime there have been. I think they can be, at least, if not fully trusted, then taken into account. And there are sort of very basic ones, which is that the IAEA and others said, there's no reason to enrich uranium to the levels that the Iranians have been enriching before. There was no reason to do that if you wanted merely a civilian energy nuclear project. There's no need for it. And by the way, the other thing that's worth noting is how some people who would not normally be supporters of Israeli or indeed American military intervention have spoken up in the last couple of weeks. I was very struck by Chancellor Merz of Germany's statement as the Israelis were doing the strikes on the nuclear facilities in Iran, that that he said Israel is doing our dirty work for us. And by us, he meant effectively the civilized world, the world that does not want the Iranian regime to get nuclear and then the rest of the Middle East to go nuclear in response. It was very interesting hearing a German chancellor saying that, because he knew, as governments across the West knew, that nobody wants to have to confront a nuclear-armed Iran. No one wants the risk, not just in the region, but globally, of an Iranian nuclear bomb and the resulting nuclear spread across the Middle East. But in the end, it came down to the country most closely threatened by the regime. And Israel, as the German chancellor said, ended up doing the dirty work that a lot of other countries knew needed doing, but were not willing to do themselves. I mean, we have this very interesting thing where Western governments have sort of called for things like de-escalation in the early days of the bombing, when in actual fact, they all knew in private that massive escalation and victory in removing the nuclear capabilities of the mullahs was the most desirable thing. So as ever, there's a lot of double speak and private public hypocrisy